I want to start talking about light and hallucinations. These things all tie together in an interesting part of the book. So I'm going to read a short passage. And, as many people have said before in neuroscience and other fields, we think about drugs causing hallucinations, but in some sense, every experience we have is a controlled hallucination. When we're awake, that hallucination is just highly constrained and ordered by incoming sensory information. When we're dreaming, it's more disordered, but it's still constrained in some sense. And when someone has, say, schizophrenia, they're just having a different kind of hallucination. That's one way to think about it. But you say in the book, a list of symptoms of a person with schizophrenia actually has a suspicious overlap with a person asleep and dreaming. We do not regularly draw this parallel because in our dream state, we are usually paralyzed and we have amnesia. Any confrontations with reality are blissfully hidden from us until we have our morning coffee. How surprising then that organisms that do not appear to have had our best interests in mind, such as psilocybe mushrooms and peyote cactus, seem to have accessed these very same tendencies. So there's a few things here I want to touch on, but let's talk about maybe the last part first. Why would an organism like a mushroom or like a cannabis plant or like anything produce a psychoactive compound that is psychoactive for a mammalian nervous system?
So can we go back and I want to adjust one thing you said before we get to the heart of that question. You were talking about this view apparently in neuroscience about our hallucinations are effectively highly constrained during the day and they become more chaotic at night. That sounds off, actually. There's one way in which it's quite right. You could say that our hallucinations during the day are constrained by reality, right? That the edges of objects have to line up with the edges of our paint by numbers world inside of our minds. But that leaves the false impression that when you remove those constraints, that what you have is noise. When in fact, the prediction of what we say in the book is that what you have is every bit as signal rich as the environment you walk around in, but the signal isn't so much about keeping you from busting your shin. The signal is about other things that matter a great deal. And so in effect, your movie-making apparatus is your visual perception apparatus borrowed by a problem-solving mind that has a different problem, a different scale of problem that it's interested in. So still highly constrained. So
yeah, I think that is a really good way of putting it. I think an experimental neuroscientist would probably restate what you said in the following way, which would be that when you're waking, in the waking state, your hallucination, your perception is highly constrained by feed-forward sensory information about the external world that's coming in. And it also gets integrated with what you would call feedback information coming from your memories and things like this. When you're asleep, you sort of shut off or at least turn down that feed-forward sensory information coming from the outside, but you still have, as you said, Bret, constraints coming from the feedback direction. So it's better to say a different set of constraints, I suppose.
Well, I will say, again, laboratory of the self. And I know because when I was a professor, Heather and I were both professors for quite some time, I used to talk to my students about what the content of their dreams was like. And I never failed to be shocked at how different people's dreams are from each other. Mm-hmm. This is a very interesting phenomenon. But in my dreams, I know that the visual information is very incompletely rendered. Right. So the stuff that matters a great deal, the other person's face maybe is pretty well rendered. The wall, not really rendered well at all because it would be a waste of time to do it. So for the same reason that a computer doesn't render necessarily the things that are out of the character's view, the mind doesn't do it either. It focuses on the things that where there's potentially proxy value to be won. But
so in your dreams, you would definitely miss the gorilla on the basketball court.
Oh man, the gorilla, he's there every time and I never see him.
Yeah.
But the question about why, let's say a mushroom would trigger, basically the model that we present is that the mushroom chemically triggers the dream apparatus during a waking state. And not to put too fine a point on it, the reason that a mushroom might want to do that is to freak the crap out of the creature that had eaten the mushroom. And the idea is a freaked out creature is actually better than a poisoned creature. If you poison a creature, the nature of ecology is such that that creature will then be replaced by a naive creature who might eat the mushroom next time.
Well, given that it's impossible to titrate the poison, right? Like that you may inadvertently kill the creature you're poisoning, even if it would be to your benefit to merely leave it ill. Whereas the titration issue isn't so much one if you're talking about an entheogen.
Right. Yeah. And the training program is spectacular. If you found yourself with no explanation, let's say that you had no exposure to entheogens, and you found yourself waiting for the train and suddenly hallucinating things that weren't there, it would be good and spooky. And to the extent that a deer, for example, might ingest a mushroom and have a good and spooky experience. And, certainly there's a program in the deer that says, did you do anything different that might have caused what happened? Because you'd like not to have that happen again. It makes you more likely to be eaten by a predator or whatever. It's a good training program.
The difference between the deer and us being that the deer who just had the psychotic break that it didn't want is likely to try to figure out unconsciously, presumably, what it did differently and never go there again. And many humans have the opposite response. Oh, that was interesting. Let's see if we can repeat that.
Right. In fact, we use it as a hack in order to tap into parts of our psychology that are ordinarily barred from, or our conscious mind is barred from connecting with them. And so it can be, among the most useful tools that we have. Or we can do other things, like some cultures would, have a shaman who would tap into that state one way or the other. Yeah. And the shaman, therefore, would allow a culture to hack its own belief structure in a relatively safe way. Because if the shaman is saying things that are particularly off, one can ignore them or dismiss them in some way. And if the shaman is saying things that are insightful, one can incorporate them. But there's a kind of compartmentalization in that structure.
Well, and this is exactly, and we get to it later in the book, but you also already invoked the culture and consciousness that we introduce in the first chapter. The shaman is the conscious voice, and the sacred, the reified, this is how we've always done things, is the cultural voice. So, shaman is to sacred as consciousness is to culture.
But in essence, what you've said is that from the mushroom's perspective, there's a defensive function being played here. The mushroom doesn't want its reproductive apparatus eaten and destroyed, so it produces something that will hopefully prevent that from happening in the future. And actually, right, there's a lot of examples of this in the plant world and the fungal world. In most cases that I'm aware of, where there is any clear evidence, the psychoactive component of a plant, whether it's caffeine, whether it is THC or cannabinoids in cannabis, it is playing some kind of defensive role. It might just be killing insects, for example, but the plant doesn't want you to eat its reproductive organ, basically.
Yeah,
it's a secondary compound is the term for it. Secondary compound means that the molecule doesn't have a physiological function inside the plant. It's waiting there for some creature on whom it will have its effect, and that effect is negative. And then the twist in humans is that the hallucinogenic effect is not always negative.
Well, but secondary compound doesn't require that the effect be negative. And with regard to caffeine, for instance, there's, caffeine is to some degree a memory enhancer. And it is actually demonstrated that caffeinated flowers that bees visit produce a better ability for those bees to, return to the same flowers.
Okay, but so this is interesting, and it extends the question of what a secondary compound is. Yeah. But if I'm to be that annoying student who pushes things then even further, what do we do with something like sugar in an apple? Right? That sugar is in the apple as a reward for an animal in order to distribute the seeds. Is that a secondary compound? Yeah,
I don't know, but caffeine appears to be a secondary compound. So I guess maybe this is just a semantic argument. You're saying we don't call it a secondary compound unless it's got a negative, understood to be negative?
I'm wondering. No, I like your point about caffeine being an enhancement of the capacities of a creature to return to a flower where the flower is got a symbiont. Yeah. But I'm wondering if
well, I think the unifying thing here is, right, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the secondary compound is it's sort of acting in another organism on behalf of the first one. The caffeine might be enhancing the memory of a bee, but it's not doing anything else so far as we can tell for the actual flower other than that.
Exactly. And I guess that's how I understand the definition at its most basic.
Yeah, I agree.
It doesn't have a value. It doesn't have a value, negative or positive.
Right. Yeah.
So in some sense, what we're saying is these plants or these fungi can produce compounds for a defensive purpose. They don't want to be eaten. That is almost the opposite of this other thing that a lot of people have asked me about, actually, just in my life, but I've never really had someone like you articulate. There's this idea that comes originally from Terrence Mckenna called the stoned ape hypothesis. I'm wondering if you've heard of that and how, as an evolutionary biologist, you would look at that way of thinking.
Yeah, I think, frankly, I like it, but I think it's unlikely to be true, is what I would say. For one thing, if what we're trying to explain is the spectacular growth of the human brain and the mind that comes along with it, we actually do have a pretty good idea of why that happened. And it has to do with something called ecological dominance, where human beings at some point become their own biggest ecological influence. In other words, most creatures face a dominant factor of, for example, the ability to find food. But for human beings, at some point, ecological dominance causes the success of one group to be most affected by its competitors for resources. And so what you get is an ecological and evolutionary arms race. And that arms race is won by people who figure out more clever solutions to problems. And this, of course, leads very directly to the evolution of language, because the way to escape the linearity of intellect, basically, if you don't want to just add more and more brain, but you want to get more and more power out of the brain you've got, the way to do it is to get brains to plug into each other in some literal sense, and to get emergent cognition, where, the sum of two people's cognition is exceeded by what happens if you allow their brains to exchange ideas, which, we don't think about it as the miracle that it is, but the ability of one person to vibrate the air molecules between them and another person, and for some membrane in the ear to wobble back and forth, and for an abstract idea to actually be successfully transmitted by that process from literally one brain into another, is remarkable. But what that allows us to do is it allows us to problem solve in a uniquely human way. So does the existence of entheogens play any role in that story? It does. We know that most cultures have some mechanism for accessing what we are arguing is the dream state in order to open doors of perception, as it were. But is it that these entheogens were the driving force? Almost certainly not. Almost certainly it was the fact that the arbiter of evolutionary success is suddenly the cleverness of competing groups that creates the arms race that causes the brain to be elaborated and then causes brains to plug into each other to get emergent cognition.